Welcome to this Sunday morning, December 13th, joint program with the Social Justice Forum of Westminster and our Adult Education Program. I wish I could be there with you and wherever it is you're gathering, but obviously I'm coming to you from the Hart Anderson living room. We've had a wonderful season this fall, from September, October, November, where we have explored what it means to become an anti-racist community of faith. We've examined our privilege and pushed ourselves and encouraged ourselves to think about what it means to have privilege and what it means to have our place in society, our complicity in racism. And really, we've tried to examine the need for racial justice in our time and in this context. And today we're going to push that a little further by going back and listening to 5 different excerpts from the fall series. And we'll be doing that by live stream. And then in the chat feature in the live stream, you'll see a link to a Zoom. And if you, after the 5 excerpts from the programs have played, if you click on that link, you'll be taken into a Zoom room where there are 5 Westminster members who are going to engage in conversation, and you can jump into that conversation. What we've been trying to do at Westminster for some time, but especially now spurred on by the events of this past year in our city with the killing of George Floyd, and in our nation with the COVID pandemic that has laid bare much of the racial inequities that have long been rooted in our society. What we're trying to do is really tell the truth about what's going on in terms of racism in our culture, in our politics, in our economics and educational systems, medical systems, and in our culture. And we're trying to listen to voices that have long been silent. So that's what we're going to do today. We're actually following a step in a book called The Racial Healing Workbook by Annalise Singh. And one of the things that Dr. Singh proposes that we do is raise our race consciousness. And we're trying to do that at Westminster this year and certainly today. One of 10 racial healing strategies that Dr. Singh offers. And he says, quote, we learn, I'm sorry, I said he, I think it's probably she. Dr. Singh says, we learn how to act more consciously as a racial being and be a positive influence on others to do the same. That is what we're doing today, and hopefully in an ongoing way at Westminster. Thank you for being here, for being part of this. And now we turn to the 5 excerpts before we jump into the Zoom room. These highlights from this past year of Social Justice Forum and Adult Education. Thank you.
We talk about the Bible a lot, and the Bible is not a book that you hold on to as this historical scientific record. It's more like a set of glasses, a way of framing or enchanting the world such that you can hear and see with those kinds of glasses. So a congregation that knows kind of the rhythms, the calls for justice, the cries of lament of the Psalms, the rants of the prophets and the cries of Jeremiah, the cries of Jesus from the mountaintops, to let justice roll down, to bless the poor, and all of those sorts of languages that still resonate beyond the first century, that still speak to us in the 21st century. Congregations steeped in those languages and the ways in which the Bible tries to talk about what it is to be a people of God, I think they have some tools to be able to respond well, faithfully, theologically to what we now have a twin crises of a plague, a pandemic, and another plague that is equally pandemic of racism, simultaneously hitting. When we have the tools for lament, when we have the tools to cry out for justice, when we have the tools to care for one another, which is also very much a part of our Christian witness, that we tend to one another, we care for one another, we pray for one another, we share with one another. When we have those faith tools that come out of our lived story, our shared story, then we're able to do a great deal.
I love the way you describe the Bible as a pair of glasses and not this constitution. You didn't say constitution. It's not like this document where there's an answer to every question if you know where to look. But you use an expression, enchanting the world. I want to hear more about that. Or can you just unpack that a little bit more? You described what it looks like, and you talked about how you approach life. But
we live in a world that people like to think of exists only in the material. But Christians live a kind of enchanted world. We live with an understanding, a belief, a hope. Even if we're not sure we completely believe it, we live with the hope that there is a force beyond the material that whose primary call to us is towards love and toward justice and towards faithfulness. We call that God. And Jesus testifies to that. And we call Jesus Lord. And so because we claim that belief, the world is enchanted for us. The world is not simply the material reality, but there is a force beyond what we see and feel and hear that calls to us, that claims us, and that affects how we interact with this world. It requires us to see everybody as made in the image of that one, of that enchanted, unseeable, unknowable, all-powerful, all-loving God. And it's hard to do that because there are people that it is hard to see in that God's image. But we claim that. And it's kind of a radical thing to claim that. So that's what I mean by the world being enchanted. We are the Harry Potters of the world. And I'm sorry, J.K. Rowling is a bit in disfavor at the moment, and for good reason. But we are the Harry Potters of the world. We wake up and realize that because of what it is we believe and who it is we claim that we are in Jesus Christ, we are in some ways wizards. and I don't want to push the metaphor too far, but we see a world beyond the Muggle world, right? We see a world that is enchanted, and that because we believe that there is a God, that world has possibilities beyond what we can think and feel. And because of that, also, we believe in caring for one another. I think it's possible to say because we believe in God, it doesn't matter what other people are doing. But that's not the testimony of the scriptures. The testimony of the scriptures is because we believe in God, we must care for one another.
I sometimes talk to students about the New Testament as a set of dissenting opinions.
Exactly.
That, over against the dominant view of reality. I like enchanted better. Yours sounds more fun. Mine sounds fun. I like that a lot.
You hear a couple of times, what can we do? Well, that is, I think, a question that we are all asking. This picture is that of actually our daughter, who is the girl on the right side of the picture, in South Minneapolis, 2 days after the most violent riot night in the city, cleaning the streets following that destruction and that difficult nights. And what comes to my mind when I see this picture that Christina took is that we're on this together. That's the only way is we would if we do this as a team. It's time to move from talking and observing to taking action if we want to see more health equity and less injustice. So some local authors from the University of Minnesota and actually also Park Nicolette, on an editorial after the murder of George Floyd. They were having a reflection on what was happening and the impact of racism, and they end their reflection in the New England Journal of Medicine with this sentence: any solution to racial health inequities must be rooted in the material conditions in which those inequities thrive. Therefore, we must insist that for the health of the Black community, and in turn, the health of the nation, we address the social, economic, political, legal, educational, and healthcare systems that maintain structural racism. Because as the COVID-19 pandemic so expeditiously illustrated, all policy is health policy. So at Health Partners and Park Nicolette, we have been thinking, what can we do? And we've been actually reflecting on the concept of cultural humility now for quite a number of years, realizing that as providers, as nurses, doctors, social workers, other personnel, what can we do, counselors, what can we do to help our patients who are from different diverse communities? And this is the framework that we seem to feel works best, is the framework of cultural humility, in which it is really emphasized the fact that it's not about cultural competence, where one can have the feeling that I got it, now check mark, we understand, we know. It's actually the opposite. It's really understanding that we don't know, and it's an approach in which we always need to come to these issues of culture, race, and disparities from the humus. Yeah, the stuff that we eat, humus, which is the Latin word for soil, and is the humus, the soil of our common humanity with our patients, with our partners, human beings from different races, from a position of humility. As we think about what action we can take, we propose that one could align into action and move into action following these basic pillars of cultural humility, which are realizing that this is a lifelong journey of learning and self-reflection and challenging assumptions. Is about identifying power imbalances and doing something about them, acting on them, and it's also about developing partnerships and challenging individualism.
What would be one step in your vision that a place like Westminster could take that would bring us closer to equality and equity in the Twin Cities?
And that's sort of like my question. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's, that's a little action there.
I have so many. So action, yes. My biggest is vulnerability. I was so thrilled when Brené Brown wrote about vulnerability, because for years I have been saying, let's be vulnerable with each other. It's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. Let's be vulnerable and say, I still feel like I'm still practicing racist. Let's be vulnerable and say, I don't know. Bring me along, help me. And I want to be vulnerable with you as well and say, I don't have the answers, but I do desire that the day will come that I can walk into a church and not feel like people are staring at me because they think I don't belong. I want to feel like I belong, that truly this is the body of Christ. He is the vine, we are the branches. All of us. Thank you.
The one thing that occurs to me is I think when you're Father Gregory Bull, if any of you know his work out of LA, but he says when you're standing with people at the margins, I believe there's two things that you can offer them, and that's humility or hubris. And hubris says, here's what you need, and humility asks, what do you need? And people who are standing at the margins will always tell you what they need. And I think so much about, I think that the thing that while not extremely specific here, but the thing that I continue to be amazed at is when we tap into the innovation and the disruptive thinking of community, innovation emerges and solutions emerge. And oftentimes we go into community and we see them as deficits rather than looking and having an asset-based approach and looking at the assets and standing in awe of what people have to carry rather than in judgment on how they carry it. And because if it was any one of us, we know that we would not have been able to do it. And that there's something about the inherent kind of resiliency of people who have had all the odds stacked against them, yet getting up every day. And so I think that that's the thing that continues to amaze me about people that by all circumstances says that they should not have survived, but have built the resiliency and social connectedness in the community to withstand. And I think it's in our moment that we go in and ask as institutions and individuals saying, what do you really need? And when people tell us that we don't create another narrative saying, no, I think you actually need this. And I think that is the thing that is going to get us to this place of freedom and justice.
In the context of the Roman Empire, crucifixion was the most cruel and also the most humiliating form of punishment. It was a punishment that was meted out often to people that the empire considered troublemakers, rabble-rousers. But it was also a punishment that was meted out to people who committed small crimes again from the perspective of the empire. John Dominic Crossan has often talked about how crucifixion was a pretty common practice, especially in places like Palestine in the context of the Roman Empire. And so here we have Jesus, who was also crucified by the Roman Empire because he was challenging the Roman Empire. And we see that throughout the Gospels. We see that in his preaching when he talks about the kingdom of God as an alternative to the Roman Empire. But Jesus was also doing things like going to the temple and turning the tables. In essence, by turning the tables, Jesus was challenging the economic practices of the religious authorities and by extension, the Roman Empire, because the religious authorities in Jerusalem at that time were working hand in hand with the Roman Empire. And so Jesus was both preaching about an alternative empire, but he was also challenging the Roman Empire. And this was a big no-no for the Roman Empire. There was absolutely no way that Jesus was not going to get in trouble with the Roman Empire. But as Christians, we worship Jesus, who was crucified by the Roman Empire, a victim of crucifixion. And in worshiping Jesus, not just accepting Jesus as an important figure, but in worshiping this crucified Jesus, we as Christians are siding with a victim, a prominent victim of imperial violence. what that means for us, what that has meant in first century, second century context, and what that means for us today as Christians is that identifying, well, challenging imperial violence and identifying with the victims of imperial violence is central to our identity as Christians. So we need to be, as Christians, we need to be in the business of challenging oppressive imperial structures. But when we see police brutality for no crimes or things that the regime might consider crimes, but are in essence not crimes, as Christians, we have an obligation to identify with the victims. If we are going to be worshiping Jesus, victim of imperial crucifixion, we should not be in the business of giving the benefit of the doubt to the empire. We should be in the business of giving the benefit of the doubt to victims of imperial violence. I will also say that as Christians, we should be constantly asking ourselves, are we siding with the empire, or are we siding with the margins? We as a church has power in the United States, and how are we using that power? Are we using it to perpetuate the imperial apparatus, imperial structures, or are we using it to advocate for victims of violence? So where do we stand? Complicity or resistance? I think these are some questions that we need to be asking ourselves.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. We'll just take a little time and allow those who are coming over from the live stream to hop over. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Wonderful. Well, as you are making your way over, and we'll just take a few moments for folks who are hopping over from the live stream. Thank you for taking this time to catch up. This is kind of, we envisioned, as Rachel and I were talking about this, we thought, wow, there's been so much wonderful content. And as Tim talked about, that we've shared from the Social Justice Forum and from adult education. And those 4 pieces that we just saw were very rich. And so we will walk through and have an opportunity to respond to the questions that came with those clips. And we'll also look just a little bit more at the framework that Tim referenced from the Racial Healing Handbook. So we'll just take maybe 1 or 2 more minutes for people to hop over. And Rachel, you tell me when you think it would be good to share the screen and just share the couple of slides.
I will do that. I see a few more people wanting to join us from the live stream, so I'm just going to hop over and help them get here.
Okay, perfect. And you may see Rachel's note in the chat. She wrote, quote, "You will be pleased to know that your picture will not be shown on the live stream unless you choose to talk." Now, let that not be a reason for you not to talk. You all look wonderful. What I'm seeing, you look wonderful. So we'll just Have a few more people coming into the Zoom room. And we are also continuing on the live stream. So we've got 2 things going this morning. While we're doing that, I will say that we're pleased so many folks are joining the live stream. If you would take a peek in your, there's across the bottom of your screen, there is a participants logo. It's like 2 little people icons. If you click on that, you will see that among the options that you have is an option, there's a blue hand that you can raise your hand. So we'll try to see your hands if you raise them in the screen, but if you use the little blue hand, we'll be sure to see you and be able to make sure that your comments are heard. So that's just hovering over the participant screen, clicking on that, and then you should see a number of options, including yes, no, if we were polling or in some way, and then a little blue screen, a blue hand.
Okay, I think we've got everyone over who is interested. I am noticing a little bit of feedback. So if you don't have yourself muted, or if you've got your live stream window open and you're in the chat, please do close your live stream window. You'll be able to get everything, all the content here in the Zoom room if you're here.
Thanks, Rachel. I will share my screen just to walk through a couple of the slides, and then we will go into the questions. So this is our opportunity to catch up with all that we've heard and to see what we can pull forward into our practices. To do that, we are using a resource that has been recommended by the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Racial Healing Handbook by Annalise Singh. And Annalise Singh took some framework from another scholar and used that to identify these, well, there are 10 strategies for healing that Singh has identified. The one that we'll look at today is raising your race consciousness. And we use this strategy to learn how to act more consciously as a racial being. We are racial beings, but we have been taught to not think of ourselves in that way. So this strategy helps us to embrace ourselves as racial beings and to also encourage others to do the same, to be a positive influence on others doing the same. This is the place where Singh takes some of the work from another scholar and adapts it to explain how exactly it is that race consciousness is raised. It's done through reading and educating ourselves, and this is where our social justice forum and our adult education offerings have been so helpful this year. We do that, we raise our consciousness by intentionally reflecting on what we are learning means for how we think about ourselves and how we are developing our racial justice competencies and how we are developing an anti-racist identity. We are intentional, and we remember and we think about how our thoughts and our actions and our beliefs, sometimes you've probably heard the term our unconscious biases. We just think about how our behaviors are upholding racism. So that's the third R from Dr. Singh. And we take risks when we see it or realize that we have been participating in it. We anticipate that because we are growing in our racial justice competencies and growing in our anti-racist behavior, there will be rough spots, there will be rejection that we encounter. And last but certainly not least, we raise our race consciousness through building and developing relationships. Those are both relationships within a community of people that we know, and going deeper in those relationships, and also developing relationships with people who we haven't met yet. But it all, as is always the case, it always comes down to we learn so much through the relationships that we develop and build. So those are the 6 aspects of this particular strategy. And so kind of keep that in your minds as we now turn to looking at the questions that were raised in our video that we saw earlier today. And those questions are in the chat. So hopefully you can see them, but I'm happy to read them as well, especially for our, perhaps, yeah, and we have a new message, so great. All right, so the first question related to what we heard from the Reverend Dr. Margaret Amer. Who can we learn from about how to see the world as a deeply enchanted place, while we also hold on to the gifts of reason and logic and science in our theological thinking? Anyone have thoughts about that particular question?
Yeah, it's a heavy question. It's Kathy. Fisher, would you repeat the question again, please?
Yes, happy to. Who can we learn from about how to see the world as a deeply enchanted place, while also holding on to reason, logic, science, etc., in our theological thinking? So who can we learn from in our yeah, who in our community, who comes to mind? Who have we seen do this well? Is the question.
I can see Phil's hand up. I also see Dewayne waving his hand. So, and Mark
Okay.
be third.
So we'll start with Phil and then go to Dewayne.
Well, I just wanted to mention one thing, and that relates to something both that Margaret Amer mentioned, but also that Dr. Miguel Ruiz mentioned too. And one thing that wasn't in the slides or in the excerpt from Margaret Amer was her call for us to listen to the stories of the people around us and to learn the stories of the peoples around us. And I remember when she did her presentation, she called that the context of history, knowing the stories of the people around us. I think that's crucial.
Thank you, Phil. Dewayne, and then we'll come to Mark. I see your blue hand, Mark. Mark Vanderschot. Dewayne? Cronky? I'm sorry, we have 2 Dewaynes here.
The short answer is you can learn from anyone and everyone. And this morning's Star Tribune had a column by Mr. Metcalf, who is a Black man who lives in the Twin Cities, but is now a former Star Tribune reporter and now on ESPN Sports. And he talks about the importance of learning about the history of race relations in the United States. So I sent him an email this morning thanking him for the column and looking at his recommendations. In the Westminster Men's Book Group, we already have read many of the books that he mentions, and I'm sure we'll continue to do more, but I thanked him for his column.
Thank you, Dewayne. Mark?
Yes, I'm wanted to speak to this partly because I'm the person who recommended that segment and the questions. And I do appreciate from the other segments that we got today, there was a lot of emphasis on cultural humility. And I'm speaking to some extent as a person now who's a baby boomer, over 70 years old, and memories of when I was a young person. You know, there was a lot of emphasis on things like integration, but it was inviting other people to be like us. And I think we're now at a point where it's important for us to see that other people may have something to teach us, and we shouldn't be thinking in terms of primitive versus rational people. So, you know, I would echo the comments that have already been made. It's just really important to listen. There are people like Margaret Amer who can be great teachers for us, and that would be sort of the really short answer that I would suggest.
Thank you for that, the three of you. And, you know, Tim talked about listening for other voices and voices long silent. There are communities that are deeply theological and have always also been able to embrace that enchantment. And so that we think that they have to be separated, that we can't have a both and approach, is something that we don't need to labor under anymore. We are smarter, wiser now, and can learn that from other communities. And also our children are some of the best teachers of that, looking at the world in an enchanted way. So that's another way that we can hold on to that.
Michelle, I saw your hand as well.
I'm sorry, Rachel. Ooh.
We had one more question from Michelle. Michelle, do you still have a comment or question to share? Michelle, you're muted.
This is always a process. So I actually just put it in for everyone to see it. There, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep. And I think
I'm sorry. So I actually just sent it to one person, but I meant to send it to all. I feel staying informed and well-read, practicing our faith on a daily basis, and mutually applying these two things at the same time. I think we do need to listen and learn from others. And I think the enchantment is an ongoing process where it builds as we learn from our past and learn from each other.
Thank you, Michelle. I see Kathleen has her hand raised, and so we will grab Kathleen's question, and then we're going to hop to the question from the video from Dr. Miguel Ruiz. Kathleen?
Well, I was just going to say that for me, a transition between the rational and shall we say enchantment is through poetry and fiction written by Black authors.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't really put into words why that works for me, but it does. So.
Yep, and I so agree with you, Kathleen, and you are perhaps giving us a little nudge to lean into the all-church book read when we will read James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk. So both reading it, and I also would say the movie is beautifully done, but don't cheat, read the book and see the movie. Okay, let's take a question connected with the video of Dr. Ruiz about cultural humility. And so the question is, what is one step you can take to dismantle racism rooted in the material conditions in which inequities thrive? Social, economic, political, legal, and education. And this question was connected to the quote from Rachel Hardiman, that we realize that all things have an impact on health and health disparities. So what is one step you can take to dismantle racism rooted in the material conditions in which inequities thrive? I see Michelle responded, staying informed and well-read. Oh, okay, that was practicing our faith, mutually applying these practices daily, calling it out when we see it. Yep.
Could
I do see a hand raised, but they're identified as iPhone, so I'm not sure who the person is.
It's Ida.
Hi, Ida.
Hi. So I was just going to contribute a little bit to this next question, and I was going to say that to be intentionally saying something about making a difference. So if you are aware of the inequities and you know that it is something that has not been voiced out, to have the courage to say it out and voice it and take responsibility. We need to be vulnerable in making a difference by allowing ourselves to be vulnerable to all of these inequities.
Thank you, Ida. Elena, you're muted again. I see another question from iPhone. I'm not sure who that second iPhone is.
Yep, and Phil too, Rachel.
And Phil as well, yep.
So iPhone number 2 is Gretchen, I think.
Hi, Gretchen.
So we often work on issues and think about advocacy, and I think we have a growing sense of that within the church. And I think in answer to this question, excuse me, drawing the connection between those things we are advocating, those policies, and the issues of the underlying nature of systems that have lasted for a long time. So even as we're looking at working on affordable housing, not simply just working on affordable housing, but talking about that work in the context of what are these underlying systems that have led us to this place where we need to change the systems and work forward. So just making sure it's an explicit part of our narrative, I think will be helpful to us and to others.
Thank you. Phil?
Yeah, I was just going to point out, building a little bit on what Gretchen just said, and that is the whole concept of engagement and continuous engagement. And I think a lot of that is being invitational, reaching out and making sure we're engaging with a variety of communities on a continuing basis. We've done some really good work in getting started on that, but my sense is we have a long way to go. And I think that even starts with some basic things like inviting more people, more voices into worship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. And again, I'm grateful for the nudges, because one of the things that we are doing this year is very intentionally inviting in voices that we may have not heard for preaching in adult ed. And so Margaret Amer was an example. And we will have a joint forum in January where we will invite in the Reverend Gregory Jerome Bentley, who is co-moderator of the Presbyterian Church USA, along with Alona Street Stewart, who is well known to Westminster. So we'll absolutely be looking for their voices, and also have another adult learning conversation like we had with Dr. Amer. Any other hands that I may be missing before we move to the next question?
I don't see hands, but in the chat from Joe, I see sharing helpful resources with one another when we encounter them, and from Juanita, addressing and hopefully eliminating the cash bail system. I also just wanted to draw your attention to the clock. It's about 10 o'clock now, and we'll probably begin wrapping up in about 5 minutes just because of the slight delay. So
yeah. So this next question then may be the last one that we're able to get to. It's a question about empire that Dr. Raj Nadella talked about. What are the empires we individually and corporately may have participated in perpetuating? What in empires can be redeemed for the good of all? What ways might we resist certain empires as acts of worshiping Jesus?
I see Mark's hand up.
Yeah, Mark.
Well, this is a fascinating question to me, partly because one of the greatest works of Christian history was written by St. Augustine at about the time that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And his book was called The City of God. And he really wrestled, over several hundred pages with to what extent can the ideals of Christianity, the city of God, be reflected in what he called the city of man, which for him was the Roman Empire. And, his conclusion was, well, I guess I would summarize it as, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, that the perfection of the Christian ideal is never going to be fully manifest, but there are ways that it can help transform how the empire does its business.
Thanks, Mark. I see Dewayne has his hand raised.
I was in a large law firm in Minneapolis, which did a lot of corporate litigation. So that was one empire I participated in. I fortunately did a lot of pro bono work representing refugees seeking asylum, which was the most liberating thing that I did in terms of professional work. So I was also thinking about the other question. Westminster for many years has had a connection with Liberty Church on the north side of Minneapolis. I've never been there, and I think we have not really utilized that connection in meeting some of the questions we're talking about today.
Thank you, Dewayne. Ken Huskins has something to offer, the author of this question.
I certainly have only small insights, I would imagine at this point, but it occurs to me that individually, if we take a self-assessment of those practices that we use for our economic welfare, what do we choose to invest in, and what impact that might have on society with regard to, quote, the empire? How involved are we in our local educational efforts and local political efforts? Do we volunteer? Do we run for office? Do we learn about policy matters that impact us individually as well as our fellow citizens? All of these actions, all of these thoughts about perpetuating an empire that has negativity to it, and also looking, as I heard Mark said, not to be let the perfect get in the way of the practical or the necessary. Where can we compromise? What steps can we take in small measure in order to move in the direction of equality and justice? But I think it starts with you individually, not only reading and learning about what the issues are, but also how can you as an individual participate in the community of others? And that can, for me, starts thinking in terms of both economic decisions, financial decisions that I make, as well as political action that I might take.
Yep. What was so clear from Dr. Raj Nadella's presentation was that we have really aligned ourselves with someone who took on empire. When we call ourselves Christians, and with someone who it appeared that empire overcame. So just for us to keep that in mind. So I don't know that there's anything redemptive in empire, but there are things that we will not experience, but others will. And so how do we go and put our bodies in between those who are experience the harshness and the difficulties of empire, that we can kind of shield them from? And then I would just share that a womanist thought, Dewayne mentioned Liberty Church. Well, Alika Galloway is a womanist theologian, and another womanist, Audre Lorde, has commended to us that you cannot use the tools of the master to dismantle the master's house. So I would just, set that right beside City of God. But then we also hear from a scholar like Walter Wink that the powers are good, the powers are fallen, and the powers will be redeemed. So it's all of these different responses that we've shared. So I pasted into the chat the primary resources that we use today, our content from Adult Education and from Social Justice Forum, and also a page talking about race from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And that's the page that recommends the Racial Healing Handbook. This resource had been on our radar, and it would be really great if we could maybe put together a Westminster small group to walk through these 10 strategies. If any of you are interested, let Rachel or I know. We would love to even have a small pilot group to go through this book and see how it feels, and then we could roll it out to our larger congregation. I will email, Kathy Fisher has requested these links. I will email them, and I'd be happy to send the links to others as well. And with that said, Rachel, I think we are now, I'm going to turn it over to you for our closeout.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who came, and for all who participated this entire season in the forums, the Social Justice Forum and Adult Education. I'm really pleased that so many of you came to share what you've learned with us as we wrap up one season. Of course, we're going into a whole nother great season, so we hope you'll continue to participate. I will mention that next week we'll have separate forums again, and related to Empire, Matt is actually teaching in adult ed around the title of Merry Christmas, How the Bible's Nativity Stories Rebuke Our Empires. So I'm sure that will be good. And Social Justice Forum has two therapists from the Westminster Counseling Center who will be coming to talk about the season and COVID and mental health. So a really timely and important conversation as well. I also wanted to plug, we have a group working on related to Ida's comment and also some of the questions from the video. We have a group working on a vulnerability initiative that is taking shape. So if you're interested in that, you can feel free to contact me about that as well. And I'm excited to continue to be in conversation with all of you. As the engagement person, I always welcome ideas and enthusiasm, passions, and your talents and skills. So if you have ideas for me about how we can continue to do this work, I'd love to help you work those out. So thanks again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.